The wagon creaked to a stop outside the orphanage, and Clara Moss felt the child inside her kick against her ribs. She pressed one hand to her swollen belly and studied the building through the dust hanging in the afternoon light. The structure leaned slightly to the left, its whitewash peeling in long strips that curled like dead skin. A hand-painted sign above the door read St. Michael's Home for Foundlings, but someone had crossed out home and written holding in coal-black letters beneath it. Clara's throat tightened. She had $1.47 to her name. The dollar would buy 2 children, that's what the notice in town had said. The 47 cents would buy flour enough for a week, maybe 2 if she stretched it with water and wild onions. Her husband had been dead 4 months. The ranch was failing. The baby would come in winter. She needed hands, any hands. The door opened before she knocked, and a woman appeared in the threshold, tall, thin, with eyes like chips of flint. She wore a gray dress buttoned to her throat and smelled faintly of lye soap and old sweat. "Mrs. Moss," the woman said. Her voice had the flat tone of someone who had stopped expecting kindness from the world. "Yes, ma'am. You're here for the sale." Clara nodded. The word sale landed in her chest like a stone. The woman stepped aside. "They're in the back." The interior was dim and smelled of mildew and boiled cabbage. Clara followed the woman down a narrow hallway, past rooms where she glimpsed cots lined up like grave, thin blankets folded at sharp angles. A child coughed somewhere behind a closed door. Another whimpered. The woman stopped at the end of the hall and gestured toward a door that stood slightly ajar. "You can choose any 2. They're all workable age. Most of them, anyway." Clara hesitated. "How many are there?" 14, last count. Could be 13 now. One of the little ones took fever last week. The woman said it the way someone might mention a chicken going missing. Clara pushed the door open. The room was larger than she expected, with a single window set high in the wall. Afternoon light fell in a pale square across the floor, illuminating the dust motes that drifted like ash. The children sat along the walls, some on crates, others on the bare floor. They ranged in age from perhaps 4 to 14, their faces uniformly hollow, their clothes patched and faded to the color of old dishwater. None of them looked at her. Clara stood in the doorway, her hand still resting on her belly, and felt something cold settle in her stomach. These were not children. They were ghosts wearing children's skin. "Take your time," the woman said from behind her. "They don't bite, most of them." Clara stepped into the room. The floorboards creaked beneath her boots, and one of the smaller children flinched at the sound. She scanned the faces, trying to see past the dirt and exhaustion, trying to imagine any of them beside her at the plow or hauling water from the creek. Then her gaze landed on 2 boys sitting together in the far corner. They were young, maybe 8 and 10, with dark hair that fell across their foreheads and eyes the color of creek water in shadow. They sat close enough that their shoulders touched, and they were staring at her with an intensity that made her skin prickle. The older boy's lips moved. He wasn't speaking to her, he was whispering to his brother. Clara took a step closer. "You too," she said quietly. "What are your names?" The older boy lifted his chin. "I'm Thomas, this is Samuel." His voice was steady, but there was something beneath it, something watchful and wary, like a dog that had been kicked too many times to trust a gentle hand. "How old are you?" 10, Samuel's 8. Clara glanced at Samuel. The younger boy said nothing, but his eyes never left her face. "You brothers?" Thomas nodded. "How long have you been here?" 3 years. 3 years. Clara's chest tightened. She looked at their thin wrists, their bony knees visible through the holes in their trousers. She thought of her husband's ranch, the empty barn, the fields going to seed. "Can you work?" she asked. "Yes, ma'am." "Both of you?" "Yes, ma'am." She studied them a moment longer, then turned back to the woman in the doorway. "These 2, I'll take these 2. The woman's mouth twitched, not quite a smile, but close. "Good choice, they're strong enough. Quiet though, don't talk much." Clara reached into her pocket and pulled out the dollar. The coin felt heavier than it should have, as if it carried more weight than silver and copper. She handed it to the woman, who took it without ceremony and tucked it into her apron. "They're yours, then," the woman said. "I'll fetch their things." She disappeared down the hall, and Clara turned back to the boys. They had stood and were watching her with the same unblinking intensity. "You'll come with me," Clara said, "to my ranch. It's half a day's ride from H. You'll work, and I'll feed you. That's the arrangement." Thomas nodded. Samuel still said nothing. The woman returned with a cloth sack, which she dropped at Thomas's feet. "That's everything." Clara gestured toward the door. "Come on, then." The boys followed her out of the building and into the bright afternoon light. Clara climbed onto the wagon seat, and the boys climbed into the back without being told. They sat among the empty feed sacks and coils of rope, their faces turned toward the orphanage as the wagon began to roll. Clara flicked the reins, and the horse started forward. The orphanage shrank behind them, swallowed by dust and distance. For a long time, no one spoke. Then Samuel leaned close to his brother and whispered something Clara couldn't hear. Thomas whispered back. Clara glanced over her shoulder. What was that? The boys looked at her, and Thomas's expression shifted, just slightly, just enough that Clara felt the hairs on the back of her neck rise. "Nothing, ma'am," Thomas said. But Samuel's lips were still moving, and this time Clara caught two words. "Your husband." She turned back to the road, her hands tightening on the reins. The sun was sinking toward the horizon, and the light had turned the color of old blood. And somewhere deep in her chest, beneath the weight of grief and exhaustion and the child growing inside her, Clara felt the first cold thread of dread begin to wind itself around her heart. The ranch appeared at dusk, its silhouette dark against the bruised sky. Clara pulled the wagon to a stop in front of the barn and sat for a moment, staring at the place she had once called home. The house was small, 2 rooms and a loft, with a porch that sagged on one side and a chimney that leaked smoke when the wind blew wrong. The barn was worse. Half the roof had collapsed during the spring storms, and she hadn't had the strength or the money to fix it. Her husband had built this place with his own hands. Now it was falling apart, and she was trying to hold it together with spit and hope. She climbed down from the wagon, her body heavy and clumsy. The boys jumped down after her, landing lightly in the dust. "Barn's through there," Clara said, pointing. "You'll sleep in the loft. There's hay, and I'll bring blankets after supper." Thomas nodded. Samuel said nothing. Clara studied them in the fading light. They stood close together, their faces shadowed, and for a moment she wondered if she had made a mistake. They were too quiet, too still, like animals that had learned to survive by not being seen. "Come on," she said. "I'll show you where the water is." She led them to the well behind the house and watched as Thomas worked the pump handle. Water gushed out in cold, clear bursts, and Samuel cupped his hands beneath it and drank. Clara filled a bucket and carried it into the house, the boys trailing behind her. The interior was dim and smelled of wood smoke and dried herbs. A table sat in the center of the main room, flanked by 2 chairs. A stove squatted in the corner, its iron surface filmed with dust. Clara set the bucket on the table and turned to face the boys. "I'll make supper," she said. "You can wash up outside." They left without a word, and Clara stood alone in the silence. She pressed her hand to her belly and felt the baby shift beneath her palm. 4 more months, maybe 5. She didn't know how she would manage when the time came. There was no doctor within 20 miles, and the nearest neighbor was old Eli Carter, who had helped her bury her husband and hadn't spoken to her since. She built a fire in the stove and boiled water for cornmeal mush. It was all she had. That, and a jar of wild plum preserves her husband had made the summer before he died. The boys came back inside and sat at the table without being told. Clara ladled mush into 2 tin bowls and set them down, along with a spoon for each. They ate in silence, their heads bent, their movements efficient and mechanical. Clara sat across from them and watched. "You'll start work tomorrow," she said. There's fence needs mending and the field needs turning before winter. I can't pay you, but you'll have a roof and food. That's more than most." Thomas looked up. "Yes, ma'am. You'll do what I say when I say it. Understand?" "Yes, ma'am." Clara's gaze shifted to Samuel. The younger boy was staring at her, his spoon halfway to his mouth. His eyes were too old for his face. "Samuel," she said, "you understand?" He nodded slowly. Clara frowned. "You don't talk much, do you?" Thomas answered for him. "He talks, just not to strangers." "I'm not a stranger anymore," Clara said. "I bought you. That makes me your responsibility." The words came out harsher than she intended, and she saw something flicker in Thomas's eyes, something hard and cold. But he said nothing. He just went back to eating. After supper, Clara took them to the barn and showed them the loft. She gave them 2 moth-eaten blankets and a lantern, and then she left them alone. Back in the house, she sat by the stove and stared into the fire, her hands folded over her belly. She thought about her husband, about the way he used to sit in this same chair, whittling pine scraps into shapes that almost looked like animals, about the way he used to kiss her forehead before bed and tell her everything would be all right. He had been wrong. She closed her eyes and tried not to cry. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the shutters and moaning through the gaps in the walls. Clara pulled her shawl tighter and listened to the night sounds, the creak of wood, the distant yip of a coyote, the dry whisper of grass against the porch. And then, faint but unmistakable, she heard voices. She stood and moved to the window, peering out into the darkness. The barn was a black shape against the stars, and she could see the faint glow of the lantern in the loft window. The voices were coming from there. Clara hesitated, then stepped outside. The cold bit through her dress, and she wrapped her arms around herself as she crossed the yard. She stopped at the base of the barn and listened. Thomas was speaking, his voice low and urgent. She couldn't make out the words, but the tone was unmistakable. He was angry. Samuel's voice came next, softer and steadier. Clara climbed the ladder slowly, her belly brushing against the rungs. She reached the top and paused, her head just below the level of the loft floor. "Shouldn't have said anything," Thomas was saying. "Not yet." "She needs to know," Samuel replied. "She's not ready. She'll never be ready." Clara's breath caught. She pulled herself up the last rung and stood, her eyes adjusting to the dim light. The boys were sitting on opposite sides of the loft, the lantern between them. They both turned to look at her. "What are you talking about?" Clara asked. Thomas's jaw tightened. "Nothing, ma'am." "Don't lie to me." Samuel stood. He was smaller than his brother, thinner, but there was something about the way he held himself that made Clara's pulse quicken. "We knew your husband," Samuel said quietly. The words hung in the air like smoke. Clara stared at him. "What?" "We knew him," Samuel repeated, "before he died." Thomas shot his brother a sharp look, but Samuel ignored him. He took a step closer to Clara, his eyes locked on hers. "We're his brothers," Samuel said. The world tilted. Clara gripped the ladder rung to steady herself, her heart hammering against her ribs. "That's not possible," she whispered. "It's true," Samuel said. "Ask Thomas." Clara's gaze swung to the older boy. He was looking at the floor now, his hands clenched into fists. "Thomas," she said, her voice was shaking, "is it true?" He didn't answer. "Thomas." He looked up, and the expression on his face was enough. "Yes, ma'am," he said, "it's true." Clara's legs gave out. She sank onto the top rung of the ladder and pressed her hand to her mouth. Her husband had never mentioned brothers, never said a word about family. He had told her he was alone in the world, that she and the baby were all he had. "Why didn't he tell me?" she whispered. Thomas's voice was flat, because he was ashamed. Clara looked up. Ashamed of what? Thomas met her gaze, and for the first time she saw something raw and bleeding behind his eyes. "Of leaving us," he said. Clara didn't sleep that night. She lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, while the wind howled outside and the baby pressed against her ribs like a fist. Her mind turned over the boy's words again and again, trying to fit them into the shape of the man she had known. Her husband's name had been Daniel Moss. He had been quiet, steady, with hands that were gentle when they touched her and strong when they worked the land. He had never spoken of his past, only that he had come west to start over, to leave behind whatever ghosts haunted him. She had never pressed. She had assumed those ghosts were small things, failed crops, bad debts, maybe a woman who hadn't loved him back. She had never imagined this. At dawn, she rose and dressed, her body aching from lack of sleep. She went outside and found the boys already awake, sitting on the porch steps with their faces turned toward the rising sun. Inside, she said, her voice was cold. Now. They followed her into the house, and she pointed to the chairs at the table. Sit. They sat. Clara stood across from them, her arms folded over her chest. Tell me everything. Thomas glanced at Samuel, then back at Clara. What do you want to know? Start with why you were in that orphanage. Thomas exhaled slowly. Our parents died when I was 7. Daniel was 16. He took care of us for a while, worked odd jobs, kept us fed, but it wasn't enough. The town wanted to split us up, send us to different families. Daniel said no. He said we'd stay together. So what happened? He left, Thomas said simply. One morning we woke up and he was gone, left a note say. He'd come back for us when he had enough money. That was 3 years ago. Clara's chest tightened. He never came back. No, ma'am. And you ended up in the orphanage. Yes, ma'am. Clara looked at Samuel. The younger boy was staring at his hands, his face pale. Samuel, she said, did you know Daniel was dead? Samuel shook his head. We didn't know, Thomas said, not until we saw you yesterday. How did you know who I was? Thomas's mouth twisted into something that wasn't quite a smile. You're wearing his ring. Clara's hand moved instinctively to the thin gold band on her finger. She had worn it every day since Daniel died, and she had never taken it off. She looked down at it now, and the metal seemed to burn against her skin. He told me he had no family, she said quietly. He lied, Thomas said. The word landed like a slap. Clara's hands trembled, and she gripped the edge of the table to steady herself. Why would he do that? Because he was a coward, Thomas said. His voice was hard now, edged with bitterness. He ran away and built a new life and forgot about us. He didn't want to remember what he left behind. That's not true, Clara said. Isn't it? He loved me. He loved this ranch. He loved himself, Thomas interrupted. That's all he ever loved. Clara's vision blurred. She felt the sting of tears and blinked them back, her jaw clenched so tight it ached. You don't know anything about him. I know he left us to rot in that place, Thomas said. I know he made promises he didn't keep. I know he's dead, and we're still here, and you bought us like cattle because you needed help with his goddamn ranch. The silence that followed was suffocating. Samuel reached out and touched his brother's arm. Thomas, he said softly. Thomas pulled away. No, she needs to hear it. Clara's hands were shaking now. She pressed them flat against the table and forced herself to breathe. What do you want from me? She asked. Thomas stared at her. Nothing. Then why tell me? Why not just keep quiet and work? Because you deserved to know, Samuel said. Clara looked at him. The younger boy's eyes were filled with something she couldn't name, not anger, not bitterness, but something quieter and sadder. He wasn't a bad man, Samuel said. He was just scared. Scared of what? Clara whispered. Of failing, Samuel said, of not being enough. Clara's throat closed. She sank into the chair across from them and buried her face in her hands. The baby kicked hard, and she gasped at the pain. Thomas stood abruptly. We should go. Clara looked up. What? We should leave. You don't want us here. We don't want to be here. It's better if we just go. You can't, Clara said. Why not? Because I bought you. The words tasted like ash in her mouth, and she hated herself for saying them. But they were true. She had given $1 for these boys, and that dollar was all that stood between her and starvation. She needed them. She hated that she needed them, but it was the truth. Thomas's face twisted. So that's it, we're your property now. That's not what I meant. That's exactly what you meant. Thomas, Samuel said sharply. Thomas turned on his brother. Don't defend her, she's just like him. She's not, Samuel said. She is, she used us, same way he did. Clara stood, her legs unsteady. I didn't use you, I gave you a chance. A chance at what? Thomas demanded. At working ourselves to death on a ranch that's falling apart, at pretending we're something we're not. At surviving, Clara said. The word hung between them, raw and ugly. Thomas stared at her for a long moment, and then his expression cracked. The anger drained out of him, leaving only exhaustion. I don't want to survive, he said quietly. I want to live. Clara felt something break inside her chest. She wanted to tell him she understood. She wanted to tell him she was sorry for buying them, sorry for what Daniel had done, sorry for the world that had turned them into commodities to be sold. But the words wouldn't come. Instead, she reached out and placed her hand on the table between them. Stay, she said, please. Thomas looked at her hand, then at her face. Why? Because I need you, Clara said, and maybe you need me too. Samuel was the first to move. He stood and walked around the table, and then he placed his small hand over Clara's. His skin was warm and rough, and his fingers barely covered hers. We'll stay, he said. Thomas didn't move. He stood there, his face shadowed, his jaw tight, and then slowly he nodded. Clara exhaled. She hadn't realized she'd been holding her breath. Outside, the wind died, and the first light of morning spilled across the floor. The days that followed were hard. Clara woke before dawn and worked until her hands bled. The boys worked beside her, silent and efficient, their faces set against the cold. They mended fence, turned soil, hauled water from the creek. They didn't complain. They didn't ask for anything. But the distance between them remained. Thomas spoke only when necessary, his words clipped and functional. Samuel was gentler, but he watched Clara with the same wariness a wild animal might show a stranger offering food. They slept in the barn. They ate at her table, but they were not family. Not yet. 2 weeks after they arrived, Clara woke in the middle of the night to the sound of someone crying. She lay still, listening. The sound was muffled, coming from somewhere outside. She pushed herself out of bed, wrapped a shawl around her shoulders, and stepped into the cold. The barn door was open, and the lantern was lit in the loft. Clara climbed the ladder slowly, her belly brushing the rungs. When she reached the top, she saw Samuel sitting alone, his face buried in his hands. Thomas was nowhere in sight. Samuel, she said softly. The boy looked up, his eyes red and swollen. He wiped his face quickly, but the tears kept coming. Clara sat beside him, her movements slow and careful. What's wrong? Samuel shook his head. Nothing. Don't lie to me. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, I miss him. Clara's chest tightened. Daniel. Samuel nodded. He used to tell us stories, before he left, about the West, about the mountains, about how we'd all have a ranch someday. His voice broke. I believed him. Clara didn't know what to say. She reached out and placed her hand on Samuel's shoulder, and he leaned into her, his small body trembling. He shouldn't have left you, Clara said quietly. That was wrong. Thomas says he didn't love us. Thomas is angry. Anger makes people say things they don't mean. Do you think Daniel loved us? Clara closed her eyes. She thought about her husband, the way he used to stare at the horizon sometimes, his face tight with something she couldn't name. The way he would wake in the night and sit on the porch, alone, until dawn. The way he had held her so tightly sometimes, as if he were afraid she would disappear. I think he loved you, Clara said. I think he loved you so much it scared him. Samuel looked up at her. Why? Because love makes you responsible, Clara said, and responsibility is heavy. Sometimes people run from it because they don't think they're strong enough to carry it. Are you strong enough? Samuel asked. Clara's throat tightened. She looked down at her belly, at the child growing inside her, and then at the boy beside her. I don't know, she admitted, but I'm trying. Samuel was quiet for a moment. Then he said, Thomas is scared too. Scared of what? That you'll leave us, like Daniel did. Clara's heart clenched. She pulled Samuel closer and rested her chin on the top of his head. I'm not going anywhere, she whispered. I promise. They sat like that for a long time, the lantern flickering between them, the cold pressing in from all sides. When Thomas returned an hour later, he found them still sitting together. He stopped at the top of the ladder and stared, his face unreadable. Thomas, Clara said. He didn't move. Sit with us, she said. He hesitated, then climbed the rest of the way up and sat on Samuel's other side. The three of them sat in a line, their shoulders touching, and no one spoke. Finally, Thomas said, I'm sorry. Clara looked at him. For what? For what I said about you being like him. You weren't wrong, Clara said. I did buy you, I did use you, I was desperate, and I didn't think about what it would mean for you. You gave us a chance, Thomas said quietly. That's more than anyone else did. Clara shook her head. A chance isn't enough. You deserve more than that. What do we deserve? Thomas asked. Clara thought about it. About the ranch, the baby, the future she was trying to build from the wreckage of her husband's mistakes. About these two boys who had been abandoned and betrayed and sold, and who still somehow found the strength to wake up every morning and keep going. You deserve a home, she said. A real one, not just a place to work, a place where you're wanted. Thomas's jaw tightened. We've never had that. You have it now, Clara said. He looked at her, and for the first time, she saw the wall behind his eyes begin to crack. You mean that? Yes, Clara said, I mean it. Samuel reached for his brother's hand, and Thomas took it. Clara placed her hand over both of theirs, and they sat like that, the three of them bound together by something fragile and new. Outside, the wind whispered through the grass, and the stars burned cold and distant in the sky. But inside the barn, in the circle of lantern light, something warmer had begun to grow. Winter came early that year. The first snow fell in November, soft and silent, covering the ranch in a blanket of white. Clara's belly had grown heavy, and she moved slowly now, her body preparing for the birth that was coming. The boys worked without being asked, chopping wood and pulling water and mending the roof before the storms hit. They no longer slept in the barn. Clara had moved them into the house, into the loft above the main room, and at night she could hear them whispering to each other in the dark. Sometimes they laughed, sometimes they were silent, but they were there, and that was enough. The baby came on a night when the wind howled, and the snow fell so thick Clara couldn't see the barn from the window. Thomas fetched old Eli Carter, who came despite the weather and stayed through the long hours of labor. Samuel held Clara's hand and whispered that everything would be all right, his voice steady even when hers broke. The baby was a girl. Clara held her daughter for the first time and felt something shift inside her chest, something vast and terrifying and beautiful all at once. She looked at the boys, who stood at the foot of the bed, their faces pale and awed. Do you want to hold her? Clara asked. Samuel stepped forward first. Clara placed the baby in his arms, and he cradled her with a gentleness that made Clara's eyes sting. Thomas came next, his hands shaking as he took his niece and stared down at her tiny face. She's perfect, he whispered. Clara smiled. She is. What will you name her? Samuel asked. Clara thought about it, about Daniel, about the life he had tried to build and the family he had left behind, about the mistakes that had brought them all to this moment and the grace that had given them a second chance. Hope, she said. Her name is Hope. The boys looked at each other, and something passed between them, something unspoken but understood. "It's a good name," Thomas said. Clara nodded. "It is." Eli Carter left at dawn, and the boys went back to work. Clara sat by the fire with Hope in her arms, watching the snow fall outside the window. The ranch was still struggling. The barn still needed repairs. The fields were frozen and barren, and spring felt 1,000 years away. But for the first time since Daniel had died, Clara didn't feel alone. Spring came. The snow melted, and the creek swelled, and the grass turned green again. Clara planted a garden, and the boys helped her turn the soil and sow the seeds. Hope grew strong and loud, her cries filling the house with sound that felt like life returning. One afternoon, Clara found Thomas standing by Daniel's grave. She had buried her husband on the hillside overlooking the ranch, beneath a cottonwood tree that had lost all its leaves. Now the tree was in bloom, and the white blossoms drifted down like snow. Clara walked up beside him, Hope bundled against her chest. "You all right?" Thomas nodded. "I was just thinking." "About what?" "About what I would say to him if he were here." "What would you say?" Thomas was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "I'd tell him I forgive him." Clara's throat tightened. "You do?" "I think so," Thomas said. "I'm still angry. I don't know if that'll ever go away, but I understand now why he ran, why he didn't come back." He looked at Clara. "He was scared, just like Samuel said, and maybe he thought we'd be better off without him." "You weren't," Clara said. "No," Thomas agreed. "We weren't, but we survived anyway." Clara reached out and placed her hand on his shoulder. "You did more than survive. You made it here, to this place, to us." Thomas looked down at Hope, who was sleeping peacefully against Clara's chest. "She's lucky," he said. "She'll grow up with people who won't leave her." "So will you," Clara said. Thomas met her gaze, and she saw the ghost of a smile on his face. "Yeah," he said, "I guess I will." By the time summer arrived, the ranch had begun to recover. The boys had mended the fence and cleared the fields, and Clara had planted corn and squash and beans. The barn roof was patched, and the well ran clear and cold. Neighbors began to stop by, first Eli Carter, then others, drawn by curiosity or kindness or both. They brought food, advice, offers of help. Clara accepted it all with quiet gratitude. One evening, as the sun sank low and painted the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Clara stood on the porch with Hope in her arms and watched Thomas and Samuel work in the field. They moved in tandem, their motions synchronized, their laughter carrying on the wind. She thought about Daniel, about the man he had been and the man he had tried to be, about the brothers he had left behind and the wife he had loved and the daughter he would never meet. She thought about forgiveness and grace, and the way broken things could sometimes be mended if you gave them time and care. And she thought about the dollar she had spent on 2 orphaned boys, and how that single coin had bought her more than she could ever have imagined. Years later, when Hope was grown and the ranch was thriving, people would ask Clara how she had managed to rebuild her life after losing her husband. She would smile and tell them the truth. "I didn't do it alone," she woe. "I'd say I had help." And if they asked who had helped her, she would point to the 2 men working in the fields, one tall and broad-shouldered, the other lean and quiet, and she would say, "My sons." Because that's what they were. Not the children she had bought for $1, but the family she had chosen. And in the end, that was the only thing that mattered.